Hello friends, welcome back. Last week we began our first installment in our Love Your Neighbor video series. Now these have been a lot of fun for me to put together, and I certainly hope you've been enjoying them as well. So pull up a seat around your computer screen or other device, grab some coffee or tea or your beverage of choice, and let's begin. To recap, last week we discussed the belief that all human beings are made in the image of God, and furthermore, that the image of God in which we are made is a sacred bond of union, which connects all people. Now today I want to start us off by reading a quote. This quote goes like this, quote, "Assuredly, there is but one way in which to achieve what is not merely difficult, but utterly against human nature, to love those who hate us. It is that we remember not to consider people's evil intentions, but instead to look upon the image of God in them." This quote is remarkable. It's saying that it's not just difficult to love those who dislike us, it's against human nature. Who is this jaded person saying this? Well, it's John Calvin. Surprise, surprise. John Calvin does not have a very warm or fuzzy view of human nature. And actually, some of this lack of warm and fuzzy tendency is a little something we've inherited in our Presbyterian tradition. We're realists. We see the ways human beings treat one another and treat the planet. As Reformed Christians, we look at the systemic injustices built into our society, and we call it sin. We believe the world is broken, that our relationships with one another are distorted. We don't believe we can fix it on our own. We believe we depend fully upon God's grace. So this leaves us with a fundamentally realist Christian view of how we see the world and of how we see our relationships with God and with one another. This is why we hold up our belief in being beautifully created in God's own divine image. Remember, Calvin appeals to this divine image and saying it's against our human nature to love one another, but look at the divine image in one another. Calvin can hold up this belief that we're beautifully created in God's own image, while also upholding the belief that creation is fallen and sin is all too pervasive. All right, so where is our word of hope here? Well, today we're going to focus on some liberation theology from the perspective of women, some feminist liberation theology, and then I'm going to read some Black liberation theology that comes out of South African apartheid. I'm going to do some reading for you today and share some of these voices with all of you, hopefully to help uplift us and help us to see some unique perspectives on how we can love one another, particularly now during this challenging time. So first, a little bit of background about liberation theology in general. So often when we talk about loving our neighbor, we think about individual actions and we focus on our individual responsibility. What's interesting is that in lots of liberation theology, these types of theologies tend to have more of a communal emphasis, an emphasis on the community and the broader social order as a whole. Actually, what's interesting, Reformed and Presbyterian theology has also historically had this emphasis upon communities and covenants, and this emphasis on how to live together as God's people. Reformed theology has been at its best in history when it has advanced this definition of God's community as one of mutual service and has held up the scriptural mandates to love one another, particularly those in the Old Testament, to take care of those most vulnerable in our societies. We also know, though, that throughout history, Christians, Reformed or otherwise, have not always practiced these beliefs well. This is why theologies of liberation are so important, to give voices to those on the margins. For example, a person of any gender is made in God's image equally, but women have historically been viewed as lesser bearers of God's image over history. Men allegedly held God's image in its most complete form, and women had it in a less complete form. Over the course of history, women were removed from positions of authority and decision-making in society as well as in churches. Women were viewed as unequal spiritually as well as socially. So, in regard to loving one's neighbor, if that person's neighbor happened to be a woman, culturally speaking, loving a woman as your neighbor was practiced differently than loving a man as your neighbor. This obviously is still a glaring issue today in the way we treat women in society, in the workforce, with the wage gap. Many issues have come to light in the Me Too movement and in the growing disparities today between women and men that loom large during this pandemic. Namely, in light of the economic and emotional burdens women have been disproportionately forced to bear over the last year. So, from feminist perspectives in Reformed and Presbyterian theology, we see that the emphasis on loving your neighbor is rightly placed in the context of the larger question of community. How can a community of people as a whole orient itself toward being more loving toward God and neighbor? Not just in our individual actions, but in our overall patterns of institutional life. This is such a big question. Now, one of my favorite writers and theologians, Serene Jones, puts it like this. She says, "From a feminist perspective, I appreciate the communal emphasis because it stops us from focusing solely on individual moral actions as the site of divine activity, and it turns our attention instead to the broader social order." In other words, the focus becomes less on individual responsibility and more on the collective responsibility of all of us together. For us as one social unit, or in Wayne's case, as one church, it is imperative then upon us to think through how to orient all our patterns of life into being the type of community that inherently practices love of God and neighbor for everyone. In other words, how can we be the type of community that gives space for voices on the margins? In the Old Testament, there are all these law codes that speak directly to how to treat the most vulnerable in society in ways that are fair and just. Examples of these people in the Old Testament would be the widow, the orphan, the stranger. And in Reformed theology, particularly from perspectives on the margins, this question of how we treat people with equity runs directly at the heart of what it means to be made in God's image. We should desire to treat people fairly and justly because that is how we love our neighbor and practice our faith. Okay, now let's get into some Black liberation theology from South Africa. Alan Boesak is a Black Reformed pastor and major anti-apartheid activist. This is from his book, The Tenderness of Conscience. I don't know if you can see it, The Tenderness of Conscience. Are you ready for just about the most radical interpretation of white guy reformer John Calvin that you've probably ever heard in your life? Okay, here we go. Alan Boesak writes, "Let me say it again. The command to love the neighbor is not romantic spiritual escapism. I follow John Calvin in this, who argues that the love for the neighbor is the recognition of the oneness of the human race created by God like the members of a body. It is the type of affection which proceeds from the regard that we have when God has joined us together and united us in one body. Because God wants each to employ ourselves to our neighbor so that all may serve in common." Boesak continues, For Calvin, hence, and for all true Calvinists ever since, it was the treatment of the weak and vulnerable in society that really determined the value of a political regime. A just and well-regulated government will be distinguished for maintaining the rights of the poor and afflicted. The call is not for Christian charity that would leave systemic injustices untouched. So just to reiterate, this is a Black South African activist in this book interpreting John Calvin. Okay, let's keep going. Another book by Alan Boussac is called Black and Reformed. And I'll have a list printed of these, but this book is called Black and Reformed, also by Alan Boussac. And in this book, he has an incredible definition of what Reformed theology is. Boussac writes, "In true Reformed theology, the recognition of the broken, sinful realities of our world becomes the impulse toward reformation and healing. It means that we understand that human beings do not automatically seek the glory of God and the good of their neighbor. This is why it becomes the Christian's task to work actively for the good of one's neighbor. In a fallen world, the structures we create are tainted by sin and will not automatically have a liberating effect on human lives." See, there's that Christian realism again. He continues, "These structures, therefore, will have to be changed so that they may serve the humanization of our world. This means that Reformed Christians are called on not to accept the sinful realities of the world. Rather, we are called to challenge them, to shape them, to subvert them, and to humanize history until it conforms to the norm of the kingdom of God." End quote. Alan Boussac wrote that during apartheid. Remember, Reformed preachers and teachers and theologians helped to justify the system of apartheid in South Africa. White Reformed Christians helped to justify apartheid in South Africa. So Reformed Christians are largely not the good guys in Alan Boussac's story. But here is a Black Reformed pastor who has claimed his tradition and reminded us what true Reformed theology should be and what a true Reformed Christian should be. Even as a Black man living under a legalized system of institutionalized racial segregation in South Africa, Alan Boussac still upholds this idea of Christians, white and Black, Reformed and otherwise, working together to change harmful social structures and to build the kind of community that loves our neighbors first, especially our neighbors on the margins. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to the beginning of our little lesson here, to that first quote I read for us from John Calvin. How do we go against our human nature and love all people? Well, today, that answer is found in community. For our friends on the margins are sadly all too used to being the subjects of oppression and scorn and hate. And it's to the community, it's this community that becomes the vision for how to practice love in the world. To love our neighbor is not an individualistic exercise, it's a communal responsibility. So we must learn from voices on the margins for how to address those harmful social structures that may cloud our vision and prevent us from seeing our neighbor fully as made in God's own image, and as if we were looking at ourselves in a mirror when we see our neighbor's face. Together as one, how can we be the kind of community that is inherently centered upon love of God and love of neighbor? How can we be that kind of church? These are all big questions for us to continue to explore together during this time, even while we are apart. I hope you've enjoyed this time together. I hope some of our reading has just made you think a little bit. And I will be posting my reading list as we go on our website. I'll be posting our reading list next to our videos. So stay tuned, friends. Until next time.